Protestos de rua tomaram os centros de cidades pelo mundo em tempos recentes, com tamanho e estilo diferentes das manifestações parecidas no passado. Incluem desde os indignados que tomaram a Plaza del Sol em Madrid, até o Occupy Wall Street, que se instalou no centro financeiro de Nova York. Chegou-se a erupção repentina nas cidades brasileiras no ano passado, com as periódicas explosões de violência por alguns subgrupos, como os Black Blocs. Protestos começam com uma ou outra causa específica para atacar: desemprego na Espanha, preços de ônibus no Brasil, corrupção na Ucrânia, e logo se ampliam para questionar muito mais. A mídia busca líderes, mas não encontra. Porta-vozes? Qualquer um. Listas de reivindicações específicas para negociar não aparecem. Partidos políticos tradicionais são rechaçados. Os manifestantes operam conforme o que alguns chamam de horizontalidade, se ampliando para os lados, em contraste com a hierarquia vertical de movimentos semelhantes no passado. Em conjunto, os protestos exibem um aspecto anárquico, parte desobediência civil, parte agressão, parte ocupação de espaço público. O antropólogo americano militante David Graeber, professor da London School of Economics, é uma inspiração teórica internacional para muitos dos participantes desses movimentos de rua. Foi ele que cunhou a expressão "nós somos os 99%, referindo-se à maioria da população contra o 1% da elite. Conhecido pelos artigos e livros que trata do assunto, Graeber se autoclassifica como anarquista, não no sentido popular da palavra, entendida como bagunça e confusão, mas como conceito político. O Milênio foi conversar com Graeber em seu apartamento de Londres.
The explosion in Brazil came after widespread street protests in the Arab world, in Europe, Occupy Wall Street, in which you had considerable involvement. When you look at these simultaneous explosions, do you find elements more in common than you find to differentiate them?
Absolutely. I think that we have a new paradigm of what a democratic movement is, and that's what started to happen with the Arab Spring. And as you say, there was a kind of contagion. It spread through southern Europe, and then once it hit America, it sort of started going viral everywhere. It was bouncing up. We had Occupy Nigeria, South Africa, Pakistan, Hong Kong, pretty much everywhere on earth. And there was a mass movement of repression, especially in the United States, but something happened, I think, after 2011. There's a fundamental break because I think what's happened, and this shows why the protests in Brazil and Turkey, other places that followed, took the form that they did, that people really abandoned the idea that a democratic movement means forming a political party, means trying to participate in the formal political process. So I think people recognize that the formal political process isn't really democratic, and it can never be. It doesn't really matter who you vote for. Policies are set by kind of global bureaucracy, which is ultimately answerable to finance and capital. And really it makes no difference. You can't reform the structure. So from now on, it seems that when people have a democratic movement, it's going to take the form of self-organized, direct democracy, direct action, and people trying to solve their own problems and essentially embarrassing the politicians into doing things by demonstrating their irrelevance.
Some people criticize the fact that these movements, they don't have leaders, they don't have a list of demands. That's not the traditional way of doing it. It's not going to go anywhere. So you think that's essentially a part of it?
I can speak for Occupy Wall Street. That's why it worked. There had been effort after effort to take the conventional route, to make a list of demands, to get spokesmen. Even in Zuccotti Park, there was an attempt to occupy Zuccotti Park 6 months before we did it, which did exactly that. They had a list of 27 demands of the government, they had spokesmen, they had trained media teams, they had a top-down organization. They took the conventional route, and 10 people showed up. They went nowhere. Nobody really wants to do that anymore because no one believes it's going to work. When we showed up with direct democracy, everyone equally participating, and refusal to join the political process, which we saw as essentially corrupt, suddenly thousands of people showed up. Suddenly we had 800 occupations across America.
You are a defender of anarchism as a political stand, as a policy, not anarchism in the popular sense of uncontrolled riots that people seem to understand it. As a historical and political concept, to what extent do you think that political anarchism is playing a role in these street demonstrations?
I think it's a central inspiration. And obviously, you have to bear in mind that the anarchism we're talking about nowadays is very different than the kind of anarchism we had in the 1890s or even the 1930s. It's infused by feminism, for example, consensus process, which has come to be seen as anarchist process, really comes out of feminism. There's even certain spiritual traditions that have played a big role. But the basic commitment of anarchism, I like to think of it as a matter of horizons. We look forward to a world without systematic structures of violent coercion, without police, without courts, without prisons.
Without a state. Without
a state, yes. Without a state doesn't mean, say, without a public health care service. I mean, but it wouldn't be run by a centralized structure of bureaucratic coercion. The problem is right now we have states which insist that they're the only people who can possibly run such things. We think that people could run them democratically by themselves. So for me, what anarchism means is a commitment to create that kind of world. The real essence of anarchism for me is a rejection of the notion that the ends justify the means. A rejection of the notion that you can create a free society by giving more power to the police, that you can create a free society by coercion, that you can create a more democratic society by centralizing power, that we have to go towards a more authoritarian system to ultimately create a more free system. That's been a failure everywhere it's been tried. It's never worked. And there's no reason to believe it ever will. We have to start by creating the institutions of a free society now. And that's why anarchists talk about direct democracy and also direct action. I like to think of it as the defiant insistence on acting as if you were already free. Let's try to create the kind of structures that could exist without coercion right now.
That requires a lot of trust in people, that people without a state, without a government, without these repressive institutions, they will, let's say, behave properly.
Most of them.
Do you expect them to?
Well, actually, I have empirical evidence on this regard. I'm an anthropologist. I myself lived in such a place. I was in a part of rural Madagascar where the police had pulled out about 10 years before. And, in fact, the government wasn't really functioning. It provided school teachers, but that was about it. And the amazing thing was it took me about 6 months to even figure out that this was what was happening. Because people were just going about their business as if the government were there and hoping nobody would notice.
At the other extreme, even in Africa, not too far from Madagascar, we have the example of Somalia, where the state disappeared, and what we got was total chaos.
Yes, but the state didn't really disappear in Somalia. What happens is the state disappeared into like 80 little states. I mean, if the state authority dissolves while people are already having a civil war, which was what was in fact going on, well, likely as not, the civil war won't stop immediately. But the irony is that I've heard it said that actually living standards and life expectancy, even in Somalia, which is the worst case scenario, have actually improved since the state is dissolved.
In your book, Democracy, there's a point there when you say towards the end that it's necessary, in your words, to reclaim communism. You obviously don't mean the line, the North Korean or Soviet line.
No, that's the very opposite of what anarchism believes.
Exactly. Yeah. So what communism is that you want to reclaim?
Well, I mean, in the sense that I'm talking about communism, it's something we're already doing all the time. I mean, the slogan of communism in the 19th century was from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. If you think about it, much of what you do is based on that. If you're cooperating with someone to solve a problem or to do some kind of job. I mean, even if you're working for ExxonMobil or Bechtel or some large capitalist corporation, if I say to someone, can you hand me the wrench, they don't say, yeah, what do I get for that? You actually operate on the basis of, well, this is what I need, this is what I've got, and because it's the only thing that works. It's practical. On that level, I think most of what we do has a certain element of communism in it, and some of what we do is purely based on communism. We're all communists, we're our best friends, we're members of our family. And in any society where people get on together on any sort of civil level, there's a minimal kind of communism. I call it baseline communism. So in a similar way, I'd say all societies are based on communism. Even all corporations internally are based on communism. In a way, capitalism is just a bad way of organizing communism. So what I'm interested in is trying to figure out a better way to organize communism.
That transformation, that revolution, as it were, who's going to be leading it? Who's going to be ahead of the movement? Workers, unemployed people, students?
If you look at the history of revolutions, sort of like, Chairman Mao, a rich farmer turned librarian, meets Zhou Enlai, or Castro, meets Che Guevara. There's always somebody coming up from the bottom, somebody descending from the top. I imagine that there's always going to be similar alliances being created. And you saw a lot of that in Occupy Wall Street, for example. There were the students who came from poor backgrounds, worked hard, got into college, ended up saddled with enormous amounts of debts and unable to get jobs because a bunch of bankers crashed the economy. And then there were a few people who were born to that class who rejected their parents' values and joined in. So those kind of alliances always exist.
In movements, the Occupy Wall Street, as the demonstrations in Brazil and many other places, there's always a group that is more active, sometimes more violent.
Militant.
More militant. You associate them, the so-called black blocs and all that. To what extent are they following the principle of anarchism and what they do and the role they play?
It's important to bear in mind that black blocs, the ones I've experienced here in the UK and North America, actually consider themselves nonviolent, but they're practicing a much more militant form of nonviolence. There's a classic example. In 1999, a lot of the people who were in the Black Bloc in Seattle had been tree sitters. They were doing Gandhian nonviolence. They were defending forests, old-growth forests that had been cut down. And essentially the police started using extraordinarily violent tactics. One person was killed while defending a tree. Other people were tortured. They were doing things like rubbing pepper spray in the eyeballs of people who were locked down. And normally the way Gandhian tactics work is that you sort of demonstrate the violence of the state, just how far they're going to go against completely nonviolent people, and it causes a scandal. Because of the nature of the media in America, you can't report it that way. Basically, if the police do something that's authorized from above, it cannot be represented as violence no matter what it is. So the people who had been doing those tactics were so scandalized, they said, all right, we're going to do a different tactic now. We'll still be nonviolent, but we'll do something so dramatic they can't ignore it. So they smashed a lot of windows. They went and sort of researched all the most obnoxious corporations, made a list, found out where their venues were, and did symbolic breaking of glass. And that went all over the world instantly. It became this great media outcry, and as a result, policies actually did change. So it was an effective tactic in that particular context.
So it works because it calls attention.
Yeah. And, insofar as they didn't hurt anyone in doing so, you could say it's an effective example of nonviolent direct action.
Don't you think sometimes that your adversaries, the defenders of free market, like regulated capitalism, might be winning the struggle when you look at the banks today, 5 years into the crisis, and the bonuses, the situation overall? Don't you get the feeling that they're winning?
They're winning tactically most of the battles, but the question is who wins the war. I think their victories are increasingly Pyrrhic. I think that they even recognize that. When you talk to people in the ruling class, which I occasionally have the opportunity to do, what I find is, about 90% of them, maybe even 95% of them don't even think about the future. They just assume things will take care of themselves. They're all taught in business school to have a 3-year horizon, and that's it. The ones who actually think in the long term are terrified. They realize that, we won the battles, but in doing so we're destroying the very infrastructure of what makes our position possible. And that's partly because they've put all their emphasis on the ideological war. And they've been very good at that. They've managed to convince people that no other system is possible. And not just no other system than capitalism, no other system than the very specific type of financialized, militarized capitalism that happens to exist right now, which is itself very unusual historically. That's the only system that could possibly exist. But at the same time, they put all of their effort into winning that ideological battle and no effort into creating the foundations of a system that actually could exist over the long term. I talked to some people at the Federal Reserve who were predicting, this was a year ago, in 2 or 3 years there was going to be another crash worse than 2008. So I think that by their emphasis on winning the ideological war, they've essentially put themselves in a situation where everything around them is crumbling. And we have this strange, anomalous circumstance where people are watching the system falling apart and saying to themselves, but wait, I thought this is the only system that could possibly exist. What are we going to do now?
But don't you think that at the same time, by your own description, they demonstrate an extraordinary capacity to adapt and move on and survive?
Well, you know, that's what you say about every system until it falls apart. I'm sure if we were sitting here in, 400 AD, people would be saying that about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire can absorb anything. All these barbarians come in, we just make them Roman generals. We just incorporate them into the system. System will just absorb and adopt anything you throw at it. And then one day it didn't work anymore.
How would you recognize the shift? How would you recognize that you're winning and they're not winning?
Well, I recognize it by what's happening around the world. I mean, we've managed to change the very idea of what democracy is. That's a historical achievement. This is another thing that I would say that I got from Wallerstein. He said, you've had a revolution when there's a change in common sense. That's why I find it so significant that democratic movements don't take the form that they did even a generation ago. Essentially, anarchist ideals and principles are the very core of democratic movements now. That's a major shift. Anarchism used to be thought of as completely insane. If you talk to people actually organizing things on the ground, almost all of them concede that those basic ideas, direct action, direct democracy, rejection of bureaucratic institutional structures to make change, rejection of the idea of seizing state power, changing society from above, pretty much everyone accepts that. And that's a really big world historical change in political common sense.
With those principles of political anarchism in mind, how do you evaluate the traditional left? The left in Europe, in America, all over the world?
How do I think the traditional left has really taken on a stupid policy. I mean, here you have in the UK a left that felt that in order to be considered reasonable, they had to simultaneously embrace the market and bureaucracy at the same time. Look at the education system here. You can see the results. It's complete nightmare. It's like the worst of all possible world scenario. Then they're surprised that working class people vote for the right. I think that the conventional left is no longer represents the interests of the mass majority of their traditional constituents. It certainly doesn't represent the working class anymore. Certainly in America and Europe, it represents essentially what they used to call the professional managerial classes, administrators, people who sit in offices and manage things, professionals, doctors and lawyers, and journalists and academics too, people like us. That's who's essentially represented by those parties. And in a way, I think the idea of what a working class is being reorganized. The paradigm for work is no longer the guy in the factory. It's a nurse. It's a teacher. So I think that there's a real change in the sort of class orientation, what the opposition is. Those people really came out strongly for movements like Occupy because we embodied this idea of a community where people care about each other. That was the sort of key symbol.
With your political principles and ideals, and you look at what's happening around the world, besides these street movements that you just described and your appreciation for what they do, what excites you? What do you see that you think it's got a good potential?
There's a series of movements going on right now which seem to have legs. The two that I'm involved with are, first of all, debt cancellation. There's real feeling, again, even shared by those people those people in the ruling class who actually do care about the long-term viability of the system, that something has to be done. And you talk to them, honestly, they'll usually admit, well, of course debt cancellation is going to happen. The question is how. The question is when, how much. You have to bear in mind that debt resistance is going on all the time. 1 out of every 7 Americans is being pursued by a bailiff or a debt collector. The default rate on mortgages, on student loans, is incredibly high. Probably, at least 1 out of every 4 Americans is like simply not paying debts. In a way, like what is practicing civil disobedience against finance capitalism more than not paying your debts? So this is happening. The question is how to organize it, and people are starting to do that. There's movements starting up here in the UK and America. There's already very strong things happening in Spain, which I think provide a really wonderful model for what we could be doing. So there's debt resistance, so that's inspiring. There's the gradual creation of structures of direct democracy that come out of Occupy, because even though America has essentially repealed the First Amendment, at least when it comes to freedom of assembly, we just don't have the right to assemble in public anymore, we're continuing to organize. So we're creating a culture of direct democracy. Hence, you have things like Hurricane Sandy. I thought that was very inspiring. When there was a natural disaster that struck New York, who were the first people in the streets doing relief? Not the government, not the NGOs, it was us. It was Occupy. We had 40,000 people there doing that. So once you create that culture of direct democracy, you have the power to do things that other people can't. We can prove time and time again that our ways of organizing are actually more effective. And finally, there is basic income initiatives are becoming a really big thing, which I find really interesting. I'll give you an example of why I think this is important. I'm living here in London, and in the UK, ever since the 1960s, every few years, we've had another amazing band, starting with the Beatles and the British Invasion groups, everything from the Clash to, there's hundreds of bands that have come out of England, seem to just regularly generate amazing music. All of a sudden it stops. You don't really have these breakaway amazing English pop bands anymore. What happened? So I asked a lot of my friends, and they all said the same thing. They got rid of the dole. Every single one of those bands was actually on public belief. That's how young people had enough time that they could get together and practice. And now they have all these work requirements. All the same guys who could be John Lennon are off like carrying boxes or doing menial tasks somewhere. How does society benefit from this? If you give people a chance to do anything they want, people aren't lazy.
The Beatles again.
Yeah, exactly. People aren't lazy. People want to do something to contribute to society, and some people have amazing ideas of what they could do if you just let them do whatever they want.
Thanks very much, David.